Title: The Shadows of Molendinar. Burn. Chapter 1. The Investigator. Evan Montgomery's footsteps echoed softly through the narrow, cobblestone streets as he made his way towards the small, unassuming village nestled on the edge of the Molendinar burn. The fog rolled in thick, clinging to the trees like an uninvited guest, suffocating the landscape beneath its cold, damp weight. The village was isolated, even in the modern age, a place that had fallen out of time, a forgotten relic of the past, caught in the slipstream of something darker and older than the world could comprehend. The air felt different here, something oppressive hanging just beyond the edges of his awareness. The sun had barely risen, yet the sky above was a sickly shade of grey, thick clouds pressing down on the earth like the lid of a coffin. Evan had travelled far for this, perhaps too far, but there was something about the village's strange reputation, its haunted history, that had pulled him here like an unseen hand, urging him to uncover its mysteries. As a historian and researcher in the world of urban myths and lost folklore, Evan had seen many strange places, had studied countless paranormal events, and had debunked numerous claims of hauntings and curses. But something about this place, it was different. It tugged at him, inviting curiosity in a way that felt less like an academic pursuit and more like a curse of its own. He had never been one to succumb to superstitions, but even now, as the mist curled around him like the fingers of a ghost, he found it difficult to shake the feeling that he was not alone. His mind wandered to the journal he had found in the local library the night before. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible, and the words contained within spoke of an ancient, unspeakable evil that had once claimed the lives of those who had dared to challenge the river's depths. The burn, Molendinar burn, was no mere waterway. According to the village's legends, the burn itself was alive, an entity that thrived in the shadows of the forest and whispered into the minds of those who were brave or foolish enough to listen. But legends were just that, stories, fairy tales meant to entertain or frighten. He had learned long ago to separate truth from fiction. Still, as he walked through the village's desolate streets, he felt a knot of unease tighten in his chest. The houses around him were old, their brick walls sagging and weathered by decades of neglect. Ivy crawled up their sides like living veins, and shattered windows stared out into the street like hollow eyes. A few people moved about, their expressions grim, their eyes darting away as he passed, avoiding any attempt at eye contact. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the distant sound of water running through the burn. It was as though the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, or perhaps waiting for someone to leave. Evan approached the edge of the village where the river ran its course, a dark and roiling mass that seemed to swallow the light itself. The Molendinar burn wound its way through the landscape like a serpent, its waters dark and sluggish. He could smell the dampness of the air, the earthy, decaying scent of the forest. As he stood on the banks, staring out over the water, something seemed to stir beneath the surface, like a shadow moving just out of sight. A fleeting thought crossed his mind, one he quickly dismissed. What if this burn isn't just a river? What if it's more? It was ridiculous, he reminded himself. The rational part of his mind, the academic part, rejected the idea. But as the mist thickened and the temperature dropped, the doubts persisted, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. His phone buzzed, cutting through the eerie stillness, and Evan pulled it from his pocket. It was a message from Alice, his research assistant. "Are you sure about this place? I looked into some of the village's history. It doesn't look good. People used to disappear near the burn. Some say they were taken. Don't go alone." Evan stared at the message for a long moment, his fingers hovering over the screen. "Taken," he scoffed, typing a quick reply. "It's just a village legend. I'll be fine. I'm here for research, nothing more. This is what I do." He didn't mention the chill in the air, the strange pull he felt towards the water, or the faint whispers that had started to dance at the edge of his hearing. He slid the phone back into his pocket and stood by the river, the thick fog wrapping itself around him, closing in like a shroud. Something was out there, and for the first time in years, Evan felt an undeniable stir of fear deep in his gut. The first signs. As the day wore on, Evan explored further into the village. He made his way to the local library where he had found the journal the night before. It was a small, unremarkable building tucked between two aging shops. The shelves inside were stacked with dusty books that hadn't been touched in years, their spines cracked and brittle. The librarian, an old woman with hollow eyes and a voice like creaking wood, had been eager to offer him the journal, almost as if she had been waiting for him to ask. Now, as he stood in the library, Evan flipped through the brittle pages again, pausing at one particular entry that caught his attention. It described the village's history in chilling detail. There was mention of the burn's first victim, a woman named Isabel Marrow, who had drowned in the river more than 100 years ago under strange circumstances. The journal claimed that her body had never been found, and yet the village had been plagued with strange occurrences ever since. Evan's eyes lingered on the name, Isabel Marrow. Her name seemed familiar, as though it had been whispered to him in his dreams. He traced his fingers over the words, the ink fading under his touch. Something about her story felt significant. Suddenly, there was a sound behind him, soft, like the shifting of fabric. Evan turned quickly, expecting to see the librarian, but there was no one in sight. His heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" he called out, his voice tinged with unease. The room was empty. The sound had been nothing more than a trick of the wind, or so he convinced himself. Still, the sensation of being watched remained, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. As he turned back to the journal, he noticed something else. Beneath the entry about Isabel Marrow was a symbol. It was faint, barely visible, and appeared to have been drawn in some kind of dark ink. The shape was foreign, strange, as though it had no business being in a book from the 1800s. His eyes narrowed in confusion. The symbol was not something he had seen before, but something about it felt wrong. Before he could investigate further, the librarian appeared suddenly, as if from thin air. She was standing in the doorway, watching him with an unreadable expression. Her eyes were dark, her skin pale as death. "You should leave now," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Evan frowned. "Leave? Why?" She stepped forward slowly, her presence filling the room. "It doesn't want you here." Her words hung in the air like a curse, and Evan felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. The librarian's gaze never wavered, her eyes fixed on him with a kind of knowing, almost like she had been expecting him, expecting this moment. Evan stood, unsure of what to say. His mind raced, questions flooding his thoughts. Who is she? Why is she warning me? What does she know that I don't? I need to finish my research," he stammered, his voice barely steady. The librarian shook her head slowly, the movement almost imperceptible, as if she was mourning something that had already been lost. "There are things here that don't want to be found, things that will never let you go." With that, she turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving Evan standing in the center of the library, the weight of her words pressing down on him like an iron hand. Evan felt the tension build. He had to get answers that only the village could provide. But now, the questions in his mind had changed. What if the burn wasn't just a myth? What if it wanted something from him? Chapter 1. Part 2. The Whispering Fog. Evan stood frozen in the center of the library, the weight of the librarian's words pressing on him like an invisible hand. Her warning had sounded so cryptic, yet it had echoed in his mind like a mantra. There are things here that don't want to be found, things that will never let you go. The air around him felt suffocating, as though the walls of the library were closing in. The journal he had been studying, with its dark symbols and unsettling history, lay forgotten on the table, overshadowed by the chilling encounter. For a long moment, Evan stood still, staring at the spot where the librarian had disappeared. It was as though she had never been there at all, swallowed by the shadows. The room felt strangely empty now, even though the same shelves of books lined the walls. The silence felt like it had substance, pressing in from all sides. He should leave. The rational part of his mind told him to drop the investigation, to forget about the village and its sinister legends, but a deeper, darker urge kept him rooted to the spot. What was it about this place? What did the librarian know that he didn't? Was this some kind of twisted psychological game? Or was there something truly supernatural at play here? Evan's heart pounded in his chest. His breath came in shallow bursts as the fog outside seemed to creep closer, enveloping the village in a blanket of cold, damp air. He turned to the window and looked out at the scene beyond. But the fog had become so thick that he could barely make out the faint outlines of the buildings across the street. The sensation of being watched gnawed at him again. He had felt it before, standing by the riverbank, and now it was here, in the library. It was subtle at first, like the fluttering of a shadow at the corner of his vision. But it grew, expanding, until Evan could feel a presence moving just behind him, waiting. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He wasn't alone. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, a sound like distant whispers, faint, unintelligible, yet unmistakable. The sound grew louder, as if the very walls of the library were trying to speak to him. The whispers seemed to shift in the fog, bending and warping in the air around him, and for a moment, Evan thought he heard a name, Isabel. The name echoed in his mind like an unanswered prayer, like a curse that had been passed down through generations. Isabel, Evan whispered under his breath, the name tasting strange on his tongue. He turned back to the journal on the table, now bathed in an eerie light. The pages had yellowed even further, as though the words themselves were aging before his eyes. He flipped through the pages quickly, searching for something that would explain the voice, the whispers, the feeling that he was being pulled into something far older and darker than he had anticipated. And then he saw it. On the very last page of the journal, a faded ink blot marked a line of text, barely legible, but clear enough to send a jolt of panic through him. She is waiting in the fog, waiting to be found. His breath caught in his throat. The words felt like a direct message, a warning. The fog outside had thickened, turning an unnatural shade of grey, as though it had bled from the pages of the journal itself. Evan's fingers trembled as he closed the book and stood up, the strange weight of the village's history pressing down on him like an invisible hand. It was too much. The pieces weren't fitting together. He had to get out of this place, clear his head, and refocus. But deep down, he knew that leaving wouldn't be so easy. The village had already claimed him. Evan gathered his things and hurried out of the library, the door creaking shut behind him with a sound that lingered in the air long after he stepped into the street. The fog had grown even thicker, swirling around him like the tendrils of a waking nightmare. It was as though the village itself was closing in on him, trapping him within its grasp. The temperature had dropped, the chill cutting through his jacket, and his breath came out in visible puffs of mist. As he walked, his footsteps seemed unnaturally loud against the silence. The village, which had seemed so abandoned earlier, now felt alive, watchful, aware of his every move. From the corners of his eyes, he swore he saw figures standing in the shadows, but when he turned to look, they were gone. The houses, their windows black and empty, seemed to be observing him, waiting for him to make a mistake. It was as if the village was breathing, alive with a malevolent force that made every step feel like a descent into something he couldn't yet comprehend. The burn calls. Evan reached the edge of the village, where the Molendinar burn flowed sluggishly in the distance. The river, dark and swirling, called to him, its deep gurgling sounds luring him closer. For a moment he paused, staring at the water. The thick fog had rolled in so tightly now that it was hard to see more than a few feet in front of him. It was suffocating, all-consuming. There, standing on the banks of the burn, he felt the pull again, the inexplicable force that seemed to draw him toward it. He was no longer an observer. He was being guided towards something. Evan glanced over his shoulder, the village now little more than a blur in the distance. The trees surrounding the river's edge were thick, their limbs twisting and contorting in the fog, creating shadows that seemed to pulse with life. The air was colder here, but it wasn't the kind of cold one could simply feel on the skin. It was deeper, gnawing at his bones, a chill that came from within. And then he heard it, the whispers. They weren't distant anymore. They were right beside him. Evan froze, his heart pounding. The voices, unintelligible at first, slowly began to take shape, clearer now, pressing into his mind. The river's dark current seemed to pulse with each word, the gurgling water becoming louder, more insistent. It was as though the burn itself was speaking to him. Isabel. Come closer. Find me. The words were faint, a chorus of many voices, overlapping and rising in intensity. Evan took a cautious step forward, the hairs on his neck prickling as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The water in the burn seemed to shift, swirling in unnatural patterns, as though something was moving beneath the surface. It was no longer the calm, passive flow of a river. It was alive, restless, and then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a figure, standing at the water's edge, half illuminated by the pale moonlight that broke through the fog. A woman. Her figure was tall and slender, her hair long and dark, cascading like a shadow over her shoulders. She was dressed in a gown, antique from another time, frayed and tattered at the edges. Her face was pale, almost ashen, but her eyes were wide open, staring directly at him. Isabel. Evan's breath caught in his throat. The name had been more than just a whisper. She was here, standing at the edge of the burn, waiting for him. He didn't know how he knew, but somehow he felt that she had been calling him for years, waiting for him to come to her, just as the journal had warned. Without thinking, he stepped closer to the river's edge. The woman's figure began to blur, the shadows around her growing darker, swirling in the fog. Her lips moved, though the words didn't reach him. The water surged, rising higher, pulling toward him with unnatural force. Come to me. Evan stepped forward, mesmerized, his feet moving of their own accord. As the water reached up to meet him, the figure stretched out her hand, long, thin fingers beckoning him closer. The mist thickened, engulfing him. The last thing he heard was the sound of the river, and then silence, and then nothing. Chapter 2. The Echoes of the Forgotten. The night had become a labyrinth of shadows, where every step Evan took seemed to echo in the stillness. The village, now obscured by the thick fog, felt like it was locked in a different time, suspended between two worlds. The whispers, though softer now, continued to tug at his consciousness. It was as though they had embedded themselves into the very fabric of the village, layering over the buildings and the streets, leaving an indelible mark on the place. As Evan walked, he felt the creeping sensation that something was just out of reach, just beyond his sight. The fog swallowed the street lamps, leaving only the dim glow of fading light as his guide. Each corner he turned felt more like a dead end, each house he passed more like a silent witness to an ancient crime. The village had a peculiar stillness, a suffocating air that made every moment feel like it could be the last. He had hoped that leaving the library behind would give him a sense of clarity, but it only deepened his confusion. The cryptic journal, the strange librarian's warning, and the inexplicable pull of the river. It was as though the village itself had a mind, a will of its own, and it was drawing him towards something he didn't understand. Evan shivered as a sudden gust of wind swept through the streets, making the fog dance in the air like tendrils of smoke. The temperature had dropped sharply since he left the river's edge, and he could feel the cold creeping into his bones. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, but it did little to fend off the chill. The fog seemed to thicken with each passing minute, wrapping itself around him like a suffocating cloak. His thoughts drifted back to the figure by the river. The woman, Isabel. Her image had burned into his mind, her eyes wide and unblinking, her outstretched hand a silent plea. He had felt her presence, as though she had been waiting for him. And now, the entire village seemed to be waiting too. As he walked deeper into the village, he realized he had lost track of where he was going. He had been so focused on the figure at the river, so consumed by the whispers, that he hadn't paid attention to the winding streets or the old houses that lined them. Now he couldn't remember how to get back to the inn. The buildings around him had become indistinguishable, their windows dark and empty, like vacant eyes staring out into the fog. The air felt thicker here, heavier, as though it carried with it the weight of centuries of secrets. He passed an old church, its spire barely visible in the mist. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the breeze. Evan hesitated for a moment, an unsettling feeling creeping over him. There was something about the church, something wrong. It stood as a monument to the forgotten past, a relic of another time. But it felt like more than that. It felt like a door to something far darker. The whispers, which had been distant murmurs, now seemed to call to him from within the church. They beckoned him, tugged at his senses like an invisible thread. His curiosity won over his caution. He approached the door slowly, his heart pounding with each step. As he pushed it open, the groan of the old hinges echoed through the church, shattering the silence that had settled over the village. The interior was dimly lit by the faintest traces of moonlight filtering through the stained glass windows. The pews were empty, their wood weathered by time. The air inside was thick, stale, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. Evan stepped inside, his shoes echoing loudly in the empty space. He could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, the silence oppressive. The whispers were louder now, clearer, and they came from all directions, circling him, filling the air with their unintelligible murmurs. It wasn't just the whispers that unsettled him. It was the feeling that something was watching him, observing him from the darkness. He turned, scanning the room, but saw nothing. Only shadows, dark corners that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. In the center of the church stood an altar, its wood dark and scarred, its surface covered in dust. A single candle burned weakly on the altar, casting flickering shadows that danced unnaturally. There was something placed on the altar, something hidden beneath a cloth. Evan stepped closer, his pulse quickening. As he reached out to lift the cloth, the air seemed to grow colder, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if urging him to stop. But it was too late. He lifted the cloth, and the sight before him made his stomach churn. On the altar lay a small, weathered book, its cover cracked and stained with age. But it wasn't the book itself that disturbed him. It was the symbol etched into its cover, a symbol that was eerily familiar. It was the same symbol he had seen in the journal from the library. Evan's fingers trembled as he reached for the book. He couldn't explain why, but he knew he had to open it. The whispers had grown deafening, a cacophony of voices urging him forward, pulling him deeper into the mystery that surrounded him. As he opened the book, the air in the church grew even colder, the temperature dropping sharply, as though the very soul of the place was waking up. The pages of the book were yellowed with age, and the words were written in an old, nearly illegible script. But it wasn't the words that caught his attention. It was the images. The pages were filled with drawings, dark, twisted images of figures standing in the fog, their faces obscured, their eyes hollow. Some of the figures seemed to reach toward the viewer, their hands outstretched, their fingers clawed and unnatural. In the margins of the pages were more symbols, each one more bizarre than the last, a language of unknown origin. Evan's eyes scanned the pages feverishly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. And then he found it, an image that made his heart stop. It was a drawing of the Molendinar burn, but it wasn't like the river he had seen earlier. In the drawing, the river was alive, its waters swirling with darkness, twisted shapes rising from its depths. The figure of a woman stood at its edge, her face hidden in shadow, but Evan knew without a doubt that it was Isabel. The symbol beneath the drawing was the same as the one on the book's cover, a design that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The whispers grew louder, as if they were rising from the pages of the book itself. Evan could feel a presence behind him, the air thick with malevolent energy. He turned, but the church was empty. The pews were still empty, the altar unchanged, but the feeling of being watched had grown more intense, as if something unseen was now in the room with him. The book seemed to hum in his hands, its pages turning on their own as though the book were alive, as though it had a mind of its own. The words on the pages shifted and changed, rearranging themselves into new phrases, new warnings. The river will call, the woman will come, the curse is complete. The words burned into his mind, and a sudden violent tremor ran through his body. The floor beneath him seemed to shift, and for a moment, Evan thought he could see the shadows moving, coming toward him, closing in. Suddenly, the church door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Evan's heart raced, and he dropped the book in panic. The whispers, now shrieking in his ears, filled the room. The air was alive with tension, thick with something ancient and dark. He needed to leave. Without thinking, he turned and ran for the door. But as he reached for the handle, the church bell rang. Once, Twice, 3 times, the sound reverberating in his bones. The door refused to open, the handle cold and immovable. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, twisting into forms that were not human, moving like tendrils, reaching toward him. A hand, cold as ice, touched his shoulder. Evan spun around, but there was nothing there, only darkness. And then, from the farthest corner of the church, a voice spoke. "You shouldn't have come." Chapter 3. The Unseen Eyes. Evan stumbled back from the church's door, his breath ragged as he tried to steady his hands. The darkness felt like a living thing, twisting around him, squeezing the life from him. It clung to his skin, crawling through his veins, pressing against his chest. He wasn't sure if the cold was coming from the shadows themselves, or from the dread that gripped his heart. His pulse was a frantic drumbeat in his ears, pounding louder than the whispers, louder than the echoing church bell. He had to get out. The pressure in the room was suffocating, as if the very air were charged with malice. Every instinct told him to run, to escape before something worse than he could imagine took hold of him. But as he reached for the door again, his fingers trembling uncontrollably, he paused. The words from the book echoed in his mind. The river will call. The woman will come. The curse is complete. A part of him, a small, fearful part, wanted to understand what they meant. What did the river call for? Who was the woman? And why had the curse followed him here to this forsaken place? Before he could think further, the church door creaked open. The hinges groaned under the weight of age and time, as though it had been waiting for him to make the first move. The whispers faded into the distance, but their presence lingered, like the faintest trace of a dream you couldn't remember upon waking. Stepping cautiously outside, Evan found himself in a thickened fog that had only grown heavier since his arrival. It felt as though the fog were not simply an atmospheric anomaly, but a physical barrier, as though it were trying to contain him, force him into some unseen corner. He squinted into the mist, his breath misting in front of him like a spectre. There were no street lamps now, no guiding lights. Everything around him seemed swallowed by the haze. The buildings, previously looming with eerie grace, now appeared as indistinct forms, hollows in the night, as though the village itself was a fading memory. His steps were slow, tentative, as he wandered into the street. The silence had returned, but it was no longer peaceful. The weight of it, the unnatural stillness, pressed down on him, suffocating him with its quiet intensity. His thoughts raced. Where was everyone? Was this village truly abandoned? Or had it simply become a place lost to time? He walked aimlessly for what felt like hours, although the night seemed to stretch endlessly. Each alley, each turning, seemed familiar, yet unfamiliar, as though the village was folding in on itself, changing with every step he took. Then, as though summoned by the fog itself, he saw her. At the far end of the street, just before the edge of the village, stood the woman from his dreams, the one who had beckoned to him from the water. She was framed by the mist, her silhouette ghostly, almost otherworldly. Isabel. Her features were obscured by the fog, but there was no mistaking the long flowing hair that curled like tendrils around her face, or the black dress that seemed to shimmer with the dampness of the night air. The woman stood still, unmoving, as though she was waiting. Her back was to him, and her head was slightly turned, just enough for Evan to see a glimmer of her pale face. Every instinct in Evan screamed at him to turn and run, to flee before whatever she was could claim him as it had claimed so many others. But his feet moved on their own, as though drawn by an invisible force. He couldn't stop himself, couldn't fight the magnetic pull that seemed to drag him toward her. As he approached, the fog thickened, making it harder to see. The ground beneath his feet seemed to change, the cobblestones softening into something more fluid, something that didn't belong to the natural world. When he reached her, he stopped, just a few feet away, his breath caught in his throat. Her head slowly turned to face him, and for the first time, he saw her eyes, empty, void-like, as though they were dark pools sucking in the very light around them. There was no humanity there, no warmth, just an endless abyss. Her lips parted slightly, as though she were about to speak, but before the words came, a scream pierced the air, a low, guttural cry that seemed to come from deep beneath the earth. It rattled the very foundation of the village, shaking the ground beneath his feet. Evan froze. The scream was not human. It was something else, something ancient, something that had lain dormant beneath the surface for centuries. His legs felt like lead, and his heart hammered in his chest, as though it wanted to break free from his ribcage. The fog around him twisted violently, and before he could move, he felt something grab him from behind. A cold, skeletal hand that gripped his shoulder with crushing force. He spun around to face the unseen threat, but there was nothing there, just the impenetrable mist. The woman's voice came again, but this time it was not a whisper. It was a command, soft and steady, as though the words had been written long ago in the bones of the earth itself. You shouldn't have come. His knees buckled as the fog enveloped him completely, his vision going black. The last thing he heard was the sound of footsteps, echoing softly, far too close for comfort. When he woke, Evan didn't know how long he had been unconscious. His head was pounding, his body aching as though he had been dragged through the very bowels of the earth. When he opened his eyes, the world was different. The mist was gone. Instead, he found himself lying on the cold, wet ground, the stone beneath him jagged and rough. His limbs felt heavy, stiff, as though they belonged to someone else. As he pushed himself to his feet, he realized with a jolt of panic that he wasn't in the village anymore. The landscape around him was barren. There were no houses, no roads, no signs of life. Just an endless expanse of twisted, dead trees and empty fields, stretching into the distance, where the sky was thick with the color of rot. The air was still, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. His heart raced, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out again. But his feet moved before his mind could process the thought. He had to move, had to find his bearings. The woman's words echoed in his mind. You shouldn't have come. What had happened to him? Where was he? And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the horizon, watching him. The figure was tall, gaunt, shrouded in darkness. It seemed to move, but it was not the movement of a living thing. It was something worse. Evan took a step back, his body screaming at him to run. But again, his legs didn't obey. Instead, he found himself walking toward the figure, as though some invisible force was drawing him in. He had to know. He had to understand. As he moved closer, the figure came into focus. Its face obscured by the cloak of shadow, but its presence unmistakable. And then, for a brief moment, as the fog began to swirl once more, he saw it clearly. It was not human. Chapter 3. The Unseen Eyes. Part 2. Evan's body froze, his breath caught in his throat. Every fibre of his being screamed at him to flee, but his legs, as if possessed by some unyielding force, carried him forward. Each step felt like a surrender. He wasn't walking toward the figure willingly. It was as though an invisible thread had latched onto his very soul, pulling him closer with every inch he moved. The figure in the distance didn't move. It was a still silhouette, blacker than the night itself, as though it was forged from the deepest shadows. No eyes, no mouth, only a looming, ominous presence that seemed to swallow the very light around it. As Evan's feet dragged him toward it, the world around him seemed to shift. The trees began to twist, their branches bending in unnatural angles, as if they were reaching toward him, begging for something he couldn't yet understand. The silence, oppressive and thick, seemed to press in on him from all sides. The fog had lifted, but a different kind of fog lingered. This one was heavier, more suffocating, laden with a kind of palpable dread that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. His mind was racing, but his body obeyed an unseen master. His pulse quickened, matching the rhythm of his heartbeat as the figure grew closer, filling his vision until there was nothing else in his world but that shadowed form. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, disproportionate in a way that made Evan's stomach churn with unease. And then it spoke. The voice was like the wind through dead trees, whispered, but carrying a weight that could crush mountains. You should not have followed. The words were a slow, deliberate whisper that seemed to wrap around his mind, squeezing tighter with every syllable. He wanted to speak, to ask who or what it was, but his voice seemed to be locked within him, swallowed by the overwhelming terror that filled every fiber of his being. Instead, his legs carried him closer still, until he was standing just a few feet away from the figure. It was as if his body and mind were at odds, his body drawn to the darkness, his mind screaming in protest. Desperate for him to turn back, the figure did not move. It remained as still as death itself, yet its presence was suffocating, like the pressure before a storm, the calm before the rage of the winds and lightning. Evan wanted to run, to scream, but he was frozen in place, his body betraying him. His eyes widened as the figure raised a hand, its fingers long and impossibly thin, extending like blackened branches toward him. "Why?" he managed to croak, his throat dry, the word barely escaping his lips. His voice sounded foreign to him, weak, as if he had no right to utter it. The figure's hand hovered over him, and in that instant, Evan saw it, a glimpse of something darker, something worse than mere shadow. The figure's skin, or what passed for it, seemed to ripple, like an unnatural wave passing over water, as though it was not truly solid. The air around it seemed to distort, as if the space itself was bending in on itself. Then came the voice again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was something else. "You know nothing. You will never understand." Evan opened his mouth to speak, to demand answers, but nothing came out. The air was thick with some strange, oppressive energy, stifling him, choking him. His breath became shallow, his vision narrowing as though he were suffocating. It was as if the very earth had decided that he was no longer welcome. The figure stepped forward, slowly and deliberately, each movement sending a tremor through the air. Evan could feel it, the unnatural pull drawing him in, as though gravity itself was being distorted, bending to the will of whatever this thing was. "Do you know what this place is?" The words floated through the air, cold and filled with a malevolent purpose. Evan shook his head, though his mind screamed for answers. His pulse raced, and his chest tightened. He wanted to scream, but the sound was trapped inside his throat. "It is a place of forgotten things," the figure continued, its voice reverberating in his bones. "A place where all that was once lost returns. And you, Evan, you are lost, aren't you?" The name. It knew his name. He flinched, every part of him recoiling, but he couldn't move. The cold, distant feeling of inevitability settled over him. The world seemed to tilt as his legs began to give way beneath him. "You should have never come here," the figure said softly, almost like a lullaby. "There are things in this place you will never understand, things that should remain forgotten. Yet, you have brought them back." Evan could feel the tension rising, the air thickening with something darker. His head spun as his mind reeled. What was happening? What was this place? It was like he was caught in a nightmare, but it wasn't a dream. This was real. Before he could process the words, the figure reached out. Its fingers brushed his skin, cold as ice, and Evan's vision blurred, his thoughts splintered, fracturing like glass shattering in slow motion. In that moment, he felt as though he were being pulled apart, his soul tugged from his body, unraveling piece by piece. The darkness that surrounded him surged forward, consuming him. The figure's hand seemed to dissolve into the shadow itself, as though it was not flesh at all, but part of something much larger, something far more ancient. Suddenly the world spun, the earth shaking beneath him, and with a violent crack, everything went black. When Evan woke. When Evan finally regained consciousness, he was no longer standing in the barren, twisted land. Instead, he found himself lying on the cold, damp ground, his limbs stiff, his mind clouded with the remnants of the vision he had just experienced. His body ached as though he had been tossed around like a rag doll. His head throbbed with a deep, rhythmic pulse, and for a moment, he thought he might be dreaming still. But the heavy scent of damp earth and the jagged rocks beneath him told him otherwise. He blinked rapidly, struggling to make sense of what had happened. The fog had returned, swirling around him like an entity, shifting in the air, thick and heavy. His breath was shallow, his pulse erratic. The quiet of the night seemed to press in on him, the silence as deep as a tomb. The figure, the voice, it was all too much. He needed to get out. He needed to find a way back to the village, back to some form of reality. But something inside him, the same dread that had been gnawing at him since he had first set foot in this forsaken place, told him that there was no going back. Something had changed. He had entered a realm where the rules of the living no longer applied, and he wasn't sure he could escape it. With trembling hands, Evan pushed himself to his feet. The ground felt unstable beneath him, as though it might give way at any moment. His surroundings too seemed to shift. The fog was thickening again, swallowing the world whole, and for a moment, he wondered if he had imagined everything. If the encounter with the shadowed figure had been nothing but a hallucination, a trick of the mind. But deep down, he knew better. The figure had been real, and whatever it was, whatever this place was, it was waiting for him. Chapter 4. The Descent into Silence. The house was quieter now, or perhaps it was just that I had grown accustomed to the suffocating silence that pressed in on me from all directions. The walls, once so full of secrets, had become nothing more than oppressive sentinels, watching, waiting. It felt as though time itself had slowed, the minutes stretching into hours, hours into days. I couldn't tell anymore. Days blurred together in a haze of darkness and dread. The house had become my prison, and every room, every corner, seemed to breathe in time with me. But it wasn't just the house. The things in it, those eyes in the walls, the whispers that slithered through the cracks, had begun to follow me, to pull at me, just out of reach, until I couldn't tell where the house ended and I began. I'd thought that confronting the darkness might somehow make it go away, that I could stare it down like a beast and force it into submission. But I was wrong. The more I fought against it, the stronger it became, like a fire fed by the very air it consumed. Every night, it grew worse. It started with small things, objects out of place, shadows moving in the corner of my eye, the faintest whispering in the dead of night. But now, it was different. The air had thickened, saturated with something malevolent, something ancient. Every room felt colder, the walls more oppressive. The whispers had become clearer, more insistent. They spoke in languages I didn't understand, and their voices were not human. They were something older, more primal. They wanted something. They needed something, and I feared that I was the answer. The first encounter, the hollowed one. It was late, much later than I had intended to stay awake, but sleep had become a luxury I could no longer afford. My eyes burned with exhaustion, but every time I closed them, I saw it, the thing I had felt watching me, that cold void behind me in the shadows. Its absence was almost worse than its presence, because I could still feel it. Its gaze, like a cold pressure on my skin, as if it were brushing against me in the dark. I had taken to walking through the house in the dead of night, trying to ground myself in some semblance of control, hoping that somehow the creeping madness would fade if I kept moving, kept searching. That night, I found myself in the attic. I had never liked that place. It was small, cramped, the air musty and thick with the scent of dust and decay. The beams overhead creaked as though they were protesting against the weight of the roof. There were boxes and old furniture scattered throughout the space, some covered in sheets so faded they looked like ghosts themselves. The soft, damp light that filtered through the narrow windows only seemed to make the darkness worse, turning the shadows into things, living things, waiting to lunge at me. But something compelled me to go up there. I wasn't sure what. Perhaps it was instinct, or maybe I just wanted to find an end to this, some explanation, some reason for all of this madness. As I climbed the stairs, I felt the temperature drop, the air around me growing colder with every step. The hairs on my arms stood up, as though the very atmosphere were charged with static. When I reached the top, the door to the attic creaked open on its own, just a crack, just enough to see the blackness beyond. The faint scent of something rotten wafted down the stairs. I stepped forward, my foot landing on the dusty floor with a soft thud. The darkness in the attic felt thicker than usual, like it had mass, like it could reach out and pull me under. As I moved deeper into the attic, I heard it. A low, rhythmic sound, a faint scraping, like something being dragged across the floor. I froze. The scraping continued, growing louder, closer. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey. It was as though the very air around me had thickened, became viscous, dragging me down with every movement. Then I saw it. There, in the corner, under the dim light from the window, a figure crouched low to the floor. It was hunched over, its back arched in a grotesque angle, its arms long and spindly, its fingers dragging across the floor as it crawled toward me. I couldn't make out its face, but I didn't need to. The thing had no face. It was a void, a hollowed-out being that seemed to absorb all light around it, as if the darkness itself had taken form. I wanted to scream, but the air was thick in my lungs, and my throat was frozen. I wanted to run, but my legs were paralyzed, trapped in the grip of that awful invisible force. It crawled closer, inch by inch, its fingers scraping across the wooden floor, leaving behind a trail of jagged marks, as if the wood itself were being ripped apart. The sound was unbearable, like nails against a chalkboard, each scrape slicing into my mind, and then it stopped. It was right in front of me now, its absence of features more terrifying than any face could be. I could feel it breathing. Or was it just the air around me? There was a pressure, a presence that filled every part of me, drowning me in its weight. "You should not have come here," a voice whispered. But it wasn't a voice, not in the conventional sense. It was more of a feeling, a sensation deep in my chest, like an echo that resonated in the marrow of my bones. The room seemed to close in around me. The shadows pressed against me like a physical force. And the whispers came again, louder now, more frantic. The thing in front of me began to twitch, its limbs jerking spasmodically, as if it were struggling to maintain some semblance of human shape. It was no longer crawling. It was standing, towering over me, its featureless face leaning down toward mine. "Leave now," it hissed. I wanted to. Oh God, I wanted to run, but my legs were locked in place. My body refused to move. My mind screamed for me to break free, but I couldn't. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. One moment, it was there, its cold emptiness filling the room. The next, it vanished, leaving only the echo of its presence lingering in the corners of my mind. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The attic was still, silent, as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew. I knew what I had seen, what had seen me. I ran down the stairs, nearly tripping over myself in my haste. The floor seemed to buckle beneath me, the house groaning in protest. The shadows were moving faster now, racing against me as I tried to make my way down the hall. I could hear the whispering again, louder, more insistent. The walls were alive, alive with voices. I didn't stop until I reached the front door, but it wouldn't open. It was locked. The handle wouldn't turn. I pulled at it, tugged at it with all my strength, but it was no use. The house was not letting me go. Chapter 5. The unseen truth. The house had changed. I had changed. What began as a haunting, a series of strange sounds and inexplicable occurrences, had evolved into something far darker, something that couldn't be ignored or reasoned with. It was no longer just the walls that pressed in on me, but the air itself, thick with whispers and the weight of unseen eyes. Each room felt alive, as if it had its own desires, its own hunger. I had tried to make sense of it, tried to apply logic to something that defied reason. But the more I searched for an explanation, the more I realized that logic had no place here. This house, this cursed, wretched place, wasn't merely haunted by spirits. It was bound by something much older, more ancient, more terrifying than any ghost or shadow. It was alive. At the descent into the basement, it started with a whisper. I had thought I was alone. The house had been eerily quiet for days. No scratching in the walls, no creaks in the floors. I thought, maybe, just maybe, it had all ended, that I had survived, that I could go back to the life I once knew. But that whisper, That soft, insistent whisper came from the floor. I was sitting in the living room, my hands resting on my lap as I stared at the empty walls. It was the same empty stare I had given them 1,000 times before. My thoughts had become hollow, drained of meaning. I couldn't think about the outside world, about people or places I had once cared about. There was only the house, the suffocating weight of its presence. It consumed me, body and soul. Then the whispering began. At first it was faint, a barely audible murmur that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, this time clearer, louder, and more persistent. "Help me." It was a voice, a woman's voice. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the place where the voice seemed to come from. I had to know what it was. I stood up, my legs weak beneath me, and walked toward the hallway. I could feel my pulse racing in my throat, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The whispering grew louder as I passed each room, guiding me, pulling me toward the basement door. I had never gone down there. I had never had the courage, but now I was compelled to. Something inside me told me that I had to face whatever was calling from the depths. The door to the basement was locked, but the moment my hand touched the knob, it gave way with an unsettling ease. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the dark, yawning abyss below. I stepped inside. The basement, a world of its own. The basement was cold, colder than it had ever been. Even in the dead of winter, the air was always thick with dampness. But this was different. It felt as though the very temperature had dropped several degrees, as though the air was soaked in darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, but it didn't work. Of course it didn't. Nothing worked in this house anymore. I had no choice but to take a step forward, my eyes adjusting to the pitch blackness as I descended. The stairs creaked underfoot, each step echoing louder than the last, as though the house itself was groaning in protest. The faint whispering was now a steady murmur, like the rustling of leaves, but it felt wrong. There was something hidden in those whispers, something beneath the surface that I couldn't quite grasp, something ancient. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened up into a vast, cavernous room. I could barely make out the outline of old furniture, dust-covered boxes, rotting wood, and in the center of it all, an old, weathered table. I didn't want to go closer, but I had to. I couldn't stop myself. The whispers grew louder, louder still, until they were all I could hear. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled toward the table, my feet dragging through the grime and the damp earth beneath. The air felt thick with an invisible weight, as though the very walls of the basement were alive, pressing in on me. There, on the table, was something that made my breath catch in my throat. A book. It wasn't just any book. It was an ancient-looking tome, its cover worn and frayed, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. There was a strange symbol etched into the cover, one I didn't recognize. I reached for it, and the moment my fingers brushed the cover, I felt it. A jolt of electricity, a surge of cold, followed by a deafening silence. For a moment I stood there, the world around me suspended in time. My heartbeat slowed, and I felt a sense of foreboding settle over me like a heavy shroud. But then, the whispering stopped. The silence was worse than the whispers. It was suffocating, choking. The air was thick with tension, as though the entire house was holding its breath. And then, I heard it. A voice. A deep, guttural voice that resonated from the very walls, from the very earth itself. You should not have come here. For the awakening of the house. The voice was unlike any I had ever heard. It was not human. It was something primal, something ancient that had slumbered beneath the foundations of this house for centuries. It recognized me. I backed away from the table, my heart hammering in my chest, but the room didn't let me leave. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing down on me from all sides. The very air had become thick with malice, and I could feel its weight on my chest, squeezing, suffocating. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. "You have awakened it," the voice boomed, filling the room, reverberating in my skull. I closed my eyes, desperate to block out the voice, the darkness, the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. The whispers had returned, now a chorus of voices, each one more frantic than the last, more desperate, urging me to look at the table. I couldn't. I wouldn't. But then, a sharp, piercing pain shot through my head, and I opened my eyes. I saw it. The symbol on the book. It wasn't just a mark. It was a seal that had been broken. The room spun around me, the walls warping and distorting as though reality itself was unraveling. The very foundation of the house seemed to tremble with the force of something ancient, something long buried, now freed from its prison. And then, it happened. The basement floor cracked open, and from the depths, something rose. Chapter 5. Part 2. The Awakening. The earth beneath my feet quivered with a low, guttural hum, the kind of noise that would have been easy to ignore if I hadn't felt, that it was coming from something deep within the house. The walls shook in response, the wood creaking in protest, and above all, the air thickened with an undeniable sense of dread. I should have run. I should have turned and bolted up those stairs, out of the basement, out of this cursed place. But my feet were rooted to the ground, an invisible force pinning me there, forcing me to witness the impossible unfolding before my eyes. The cracks in the floor spread wider, fissures that split the earth like the open mouth of some ancient, ravenous creature. From deep within the earth, there was a sound, an unmistakable scraping, like something being dragged through the dirt. It was slow, deliberate, and terrifying. The whispers had stopped, leaving only the silence of the room. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, louder than it had ever been. The chill in the air crawled beneath my skin, seeping into my bones, numbing me, until the cold seemed like it was coming from the very heart of the house itself. I tried to move, tried to force myself to flee, but my body refused to cooperate. Every part of me was frozen, paralyzed by some unseen power. My eyes remained fixed on the floor, where the cracks had widened into an opening that pulsed with unnatural light, flickering like a dying candle. And then, it rose. A figure, tall and towering, emerged from the depths. It wasn't human, nor was it entirely monstrous. It was something in between, something that should never have been allowed to exist in this world. Its shape was fluid, like dark smoke or oil, but within that darkness, I could make out the faintest outlines of limbs and a face, its form twisted and contorted, as if it were struggling to keep itself together. The face. It was the last thing I should have looked at, but I couldn't help myself. There, barely visible within the darkness, I saw its eyes. Eyes that seemed to burn with an intensity that was not of this world, glowing faintly like dying embers. And when it saw me, the air shifted. Time itself seemed to freeze for a heartbeat. "You have awakened me," it said, its voice a rasping, hissing sound, like metal dragging against stone. "Now you will help me." My breath hitched in my throat, and I tried to speak, tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The thing in front of me was drawing closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. Each step it took made the air grow colder, the shadows deeper. I wanted to close my eyes, to retreat into the comforting oblivion of darkness, but I couldn't. I was trapped, not just in this basement, but within the gaze of this entity, this thing that had waited for so long, bound to the house, bound to the earth beneath. I had broken the seal. I had opened the door to whatever nightmare was buried here. The entity, no, the creature, extended a long, elongated arm toward me. Its fingers stretched wide. I could see the joints bend and twist in unnatural ways, like a broken doll. Its fingers were covered in something like thick, tarry blackness, seeping down the length of its arm in slow, creeping rivulets. The thing's touch was death itself, and as it moved toward me, I could feel the very air around me growing heavier, thicker. "Come closer," it hissed, a voice that sounded more like a command than a plea. "You will help me now. You will serve me just as your ancestors did." I recoiled, stumbling backward, desperate to escape the thing's reach. But the moment I moved, the floor seemed to shift beneath me. The darkness wrapped around my ankles like tendrils, pulling me back toward the center of the room. A cold, jagged pain shot through my chest, and I gasped, clutching at the air in front of me as if it would somehow stop the suffocating weight pressing against my lungs. I fell to my knees, my vision swimming with the overwhelming sense of wrongness that permeated the very atmosphere. The walls groaned. The house itself was shifting, moving, alive in a way I had never experienced before. The creature loomed closer, its face now visible in full. It had no true features, no skin, no mouth. Instead, it was like a black hole, an abyss staring back at me, swallowing everything in its gaze. Its eyes, those eyes, glowed with an unearthly light, a light that was both inviting and suffocating, like a trap closing around me. "You can feel it, can't you?" The creature's voice was low, vibrating in my bones. The hunger, the emptiness, the need for it to end, the need to feed. I shook my head, feeling the icy tendrils of dread curl around my spine. I couldn't breathe. The air was too thick with the weight of the house, with the weight of the thing that stood before me, a nightmare given form. It reached down, its black, liquid fingers brushing against my forehead, and in that instant, my mind exploded in a wave of darkness. Images flashed before me, endless corridors of bone, faces twisted in agony, screams that echoed through my skull, and a presence, a force that had always been here, buried beneath layers of time, waiting for me. It had always been waiting for someone like me, someone who would break the seal. "You are the key," it whispered, its voice threading through my consciousness. "You will free me, and in doing so, you will free yourself." The darkness began to consume me, not in the way I thought it would. It didn't swallow me whole. No, it wrapped around me, into me, a part of me now. I felt my pulse slow, my mind hazy, as if I was being dragged into some deep, forgotten chasm where time had no meaning. And in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't just a house. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was a prison. And I had just set it free. Chapter 6. Beneath the surface. The air in the house grew thicker, more suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was being bent and twisted by an unseen hand. I stumbled through the hallway, the floor beneath me groaning, every step like a heavy drumbeat echoing through the darkness. The house felt alive, its walls pulsating with an ancient, malevolent energy, breathing in time with my racing heart. I hadn't thought I'd survive the basement, but somehow I had made it out. That thing, the entity, had given me no choice. I wasn't free, not by any stretch of the imagination. The moment I set foot in that house, I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't have imagined how deep the horror ran. It wasn't just the house that was haunted. It was alive, and it was waiting for me. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that clung to my thoughts like a second skin. Every corner of the house seemed to warp into something new, something darker, as if the house itself was reshaping itself in response to the entity's awakening. The floorboards creaked underfoot, not just from age, but from something else, something more sinister. It felt like the walls were closing in, squeezing the life out of me. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The house was no longer a mere structure. It had become something else, a reflection of the thing trapped beneath it, perhaps. The longer I stayed here, the more I felt the pull of its presence, an invisible force dragging me toward it, towards the heart of the nightmare. I was dizzy, my legs wobbled beneath me, and I leaned against the wall for support. The silence was deafening, thick with the weight of something unspeakable. But that silence was always broken, replaced by the faintest, most delicate sound, the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the quietest whisper of a breeze. But as I listened, it grew louder, more distinct. The sound came from behind me, from the wall at the end of the hallway. I turned slowly, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. A shadow, a movement, something shifting. I didn't think. My feet were already moving, a primal instinct taking over as I rushed down the hall. The scratching grew louder, and the air felt thick with the stench of decay. The closer I got, the more my chest tightened. I didn't want to see what was on the other side of that wall. I didn't want to see the truth. But I knew that if I didn't, it would follow me, hunt me down like a bloodhound until there was nowhere left to run. I reached the wall, my hand trembling as I touched the cold, peeling paint. It felt wrong. The surface wasn't just old, it felt unnatural, as though it had been there far longer than the house itself. I pushed, and to my shock, the wall shifted inward with a low, groaning sound. Behind it, there was darkness. Blackness so deep, I couldn't tell if it was a hole in the wall or simply the absence of light. My breath caught in my throat. I should have turned back. I should have gone to the door, grabbed my things, and fled, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward, a force I couldn't resist. The same force that had driven me to open that basement door in the first place. I stepped forward, my foot slipping into the void. There was no floor beneath me, just emptiness, like stepping into the mouth of some giant creature that had been waiting for millennia. I fell, plummeted, down into the dark. For a moment, I felt weightless, my body floating in the nothingness, as if I were suspended in time itself. And then I landed. The ground was cold, damp, and rough against my skin like jagged stone. I lay there for a moment, disoriented, trying to gather my bearings. It was impossible to tell where I was. The air was thick with dust, and there was a faint smell of rot in the air. I stood, my legs shaking as I looked around. There were no walls here, no ceiling, just an endless abyss of blackness stretching in all directions. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. Shapes in the darkness, shapes that shouldn't have been there. They were not solid figures, but fleeting shadows, shifting and swirling like smoke. But they were real. I could feel them. Their presence was palpable, as though they were moving just beneath the surface of the air, circling me, watching me. Suddenly, a voice, a whisper, low and guttural, like the sound of something scraping its nails across a chalkboard. "You came back." I froze. The voice was familiar but distorted, twisted by time and the weight of the darkness surrounding me. It was the entity, the thing from the basement. It was here, somewhere in this void, speaking to me. "You opened the door," it continued, its voice rasping like dry leaves in the wind. "Now you will never leave." I tried to speak, to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The air was suffocating. The shadows seemed to press in closer, creeping over me like an oily film. "You cannot escape me," the voice hissed. "I am inside you now. You can feel me. You are mine." I stumbled backward, my hands groping blindly for something, anything, but there was nothing. Just more darkness, more shadows, and then I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of my vision, just out of reach, but close enough that I could feel its presence, its weight. It was tall, too tall, and its form was distorted, like a figure carved from shadows. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning with a hatred that seethed beneath the surface. "You freed me," the voice spoke again, now unmistakably close. "And now, I will claim what is mine." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The darkness was suffocating, drowning me. The shadows reached for me, clawing at my skin, pulling me closer to the thing that stood just beyond the veil. My pulse quickened, my heart racing. I tried to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as if the air itself had become a barrier, wrapping around me, keeping me rooted to the spot. "You will serve me," the entity whispered, its voice sending a shiver down my spine. "And you will never leave." And then, there was nothing. Chapter 6, Beneath the Surface, Part 2. The world around me dissolved, swallowed whole by the oppressive, suffocating blackness that pressed in from all sides. My heart, once racing with fear, now seemed to stop altogether, leaving behind only the cold, trembling aftershock of a body caught in the grip of something far beyond comprehension. I could feel the air thickening, wrapping itself around my throat like a tight noose, Each breath I drew felt as if I were drowning in it. Heavy, sluggish, like my lungs were no longer meant to draw in the air that belonged to this place. The shadows shifted and writhed, forming shapes in the dark that seemed to dissolve before I could fully comprehend them. I couldn't look away. My eyes were fixed, unwillingly, on that figure just beyond the corner of my vision, the one that stood so still, yet seemed to loom over me like a giant, whispering presence. The voice returned, its deep, guttural tone echoing in the vacuum of the void. You can feel it now, can't you? It was no longer just a whisper. It was a presence, a pulse, a beat, a vibration that reverberated through my bones. I could feel it inside me, creeping along the edges of my thoughts, slithering into the cracks of my memories like ink spreading through water. The thing that had been a shadow before was now something more, something solid. I took a step back, or tried to. My legs were too weak, as though the very act of moving had become a burden. The ground beneath me wasn't firm. It shifted with every motion, like the earth itself had come alive, a shifting mass of writhing tendrils that threatened to pull me under. I lost my footing, falling hard, scraping my palms against the jagged stone beneath me. The coldness seeped into my skin, numbing my hands. But it wasn't just the stone that felt cold. I felt something else, something darker, colder, something that was watching me. I will show you what you have unlocked, what you have set free. The voice slithered into my ears like a thread, weaving through the fabric of my consciousness. I could barely hold on to my thoughts. Everything around me was falling apart, and the shadows began to twist again, their shapes more defined now. Faces, hands, limbs, all contorted, all grotesque. They were everywhere, reaching out to me, crawling toward me with the urgency of starving creatures. The air was thick with their presence. They were trapped here, like me, or worse. They were made for this place. The walls seemed to breathe, exhaling the deep, slow breath of something ancient, something that had been here long before I ever stepped through the door. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. There was only that sound, the low, rhythmic hum of a presence that could not be described, the beat of something deep in the bowels of this place, something alive. The shadows closed in, pressing against my body, their icy touch crawling up my spine, whispering, murmuring things in languages I couldn't understand. But the tone was familiar. It was the same voice that had followed me through the house, that had whispered in the basement. I could hear it now, not just in my ears but in my mind, in my very soul. You freed me, the voice whispered. You opened the door, and now I felt it, the shift. It was like something inside me broke, like a switch had been flipped. The darkness that surrounded me seeped into my veins, flooding my body with a cold, unnatural stillness. I could feel it in my chest, in my lungs. It was as if something had reached inside me, touched the very core of my being. A part of me was fading, dissolving into the darkness. And now you belong to me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The entity was inside me, and it was consuming me. I could feel it slithering along the surface of my thoughts, twisting them, reshaping them. What had been a fleeting fear became an overwhelming certainty. There was no escape, no way to fight this. I looked down at my hands, and what I saw made my stomach turn. The skin was rotting, crumbling beneath my touch. It wasn't just the decay of time, the slow erosion of age. It was something else, something deep, a corruption that ran through the very marrow of my bones. I pulled my hand back, but it was too late. I could feel it. The darkness inside me had already begun to spread. The shadows were no longer just moving around me. They were inside me, gnawing, tearing. A festering thing lodged deep in my soul. I could feel them clinging to the inside of my skull, to my very mind. They whispered of secrets, of things that no human was meant to know, things so terrifying that I could scarcely comprehend them. You're mine now, the voice purred, its words seeping into the very core of my consciousness. You opened the door, and now you will never leave. Not in body, and certainly not in spirit. The ground beneath me trembled. I felt a pressure, a weight that seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. It wasn't physical, but it was suffocating all the same. Something rising, something stirring beneath the surface of the earth. I could see it now, the outline of a figure just out of reach. Its shape was no longer just a shadow. It was solidifying, becoming more than just a presence. I could see its eyes, glowing faintly in the blackness. They were filled with hunger. But more than that, they were filled with rage. It was watching me, waiting, and then I heard it. The thing that made my blood run cold. You can never leave. The words were a promise, a curse. The thing in front of me wasn't just a malevolent presence. It was something worse. It was something that had been trapped in this place, held within its walls, its very fabric, for eons. And now, with my actions, I had given it the freedom to consume everything around me. The darkness pressed in even tighter, until I could no longer breathe, until there was no air left to draw. I felt my chest constrict, my vision beginning to blur, the world around me swirling into a vortex of blackness. It was as though the very floor had vanished beneath my feet, and I was falling into an endless abyss. But this was no ordinary abyss. It was alive. It had always been alive. I felt a sudden jolt, a shock of pain as though something sharp had pierced my skin, but there was nothing there. It was the darkness itself. It was feeding on me. And then I heard it. A scream. A high-pitched, blood-curdling scream. My scream. But it wasn't just my voice. It was everyone. All the souls that had been trapped here, twisted by this place, consumed by the entity that had always been waiting. They were reaching for me, clawing at me, begging for release. But I couldn't help them. I couldn't even help myself. I was already gone. Chapter 7. In the eye of the storm. The air was thick, too thick. It clung to my skin like a second layer, sticky and suffocating, as if the atmosphere itself was trying to absorb me, to swallow me whole. I was trapped in a loop. No, not a loop, a cycle, a never-ending wheel of torment, each revolution tightening its grip on my mind. The house, no, the place, the presence, it wasn't just a structure anymore. It was alive, breathing, pulsing with a malevolent energy that fed on the fear of those who dared to step inside. I had stepped into it, and now I was a part of it, woven into the very fibers of its being. The walls seemed to be closing in, though I couldn't tell if it was my senses being twisted by the malevolence that hung over everything, or if it was something far worse, something tangible. I could hear my own breath, shallow and erratic, as it filled the room with the noise of my panic. The silence in between was heavier still. I could still feel it, the pull from the basement. I had tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I had imagined it all. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. Whatever it was real. The thing that had been waiting, watching, waiting for me to open the door. And now, I was waiting too. The lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows that twisted and swirled like dark rivers, trying to stretch across the walls and consume every corner of the room. It was then that I noticed the stillness of the air, the smell of something decaying, faint but distinct. The scent seemed to leak from the walls themselves, seeping through the cracks like a slow poison. I took a step back, instinctively, but the floor beneath me didn't yield. It wasn't wood, it wasn't stone, it was something else. The texture was wrong, like a membrane, soft and pulsing underfoot. I felt the walls closing in around me, inch by inch, as if the house was coming alive again, shifting, reshaping itself to fit its new tenant. My hands trembled as I reached out, feeling for something to steady myself. My fingers brushed against the surface of a small, jagged piece of stone, rough and sharp. And as I picked it up, I felt something stir beneath me. A low, rumbling growl echoed from deep within the foundations, and the floor vibrated with the intensity of it. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a violent drum that threatened to burst through my ribs. The sensation of being watched was unbearable now. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a certainty. It was real. I turned quickly, searching the darkened corners of the room, but there was nothing there, nothing visible. But I knew something was there, something always was. And then, the whisper came. You're not alone. The words slid into my mind like liquid poison, cold and slick. My body froze, but not out of fear. It wasn't fear that held me in place. It was something worse. Something beyond fear. A compulsion. A need to listen. To hear more. To understand. I was pulled toward it, like a moth to the flame. We've been waiting for you. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body didn't respond. It was as if I had no control over it anymore. Like the house had taken over completely. There were no more choices, no more options. I staggered forward, my legs unsteady beneath me, as the voice, their voice, rippled through my mind again. It's time. I knew then, with a certainty that chilled me to the marrow, that this was no longer my world. I had crossed over. I had stepped past the point of no return, and there was no going back. The darkness thickened. It became tangible, reaching out, touching me with unseen hands. I tried to pull away, but the walls themselves seemed to lunge forward, their weight pressing me down, forcing me into the corner of the room. Welcome to the end. The voice was everywhere and nowhere. It was in my mind, in my bones, in the very blood that pulsed through my veins. I wanted to scream again, but no sound escaped me. I was paralyzed, unable to even move my lips. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows, barely visible, just a silhouette against the backdrop of darkness. The air seemed to shift around it, warping, bending, as though the very fabric of reality was struggling to keep its shape. The figure stepped forward, and in the dim light, I could see its features. Its hollow eyes, its cracked and twisted mouth, its skin like charred parchment. It wasn't human. It never had been. And it wasn't alone. Dozens of them. Hundreds, perhaps. Shadowy forms, faint whispers of shapes that danced on the edge of my vision, all reaching out, all pulling at me with invisible hands. You're one of us now. The voice was everywhere. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape them. And deep down, I knew this was it. This was what I had unleashed. This was the price of my curiosity, of opening the door. There was no escape now. I was already gone. Chapter 7. In the Eye of the Storm. Part 2. The walls around me seemed to breathe. Slowly. Deeply. Unrelenting. The floor beneath my feet shifted as though it had a mind of its own, groaning in protest as I moved through the house. I had lost all sense of time. How long had I been here? Hours? Days? Or perhaps it was only minutes. Minutes that stretched endlessly in the grip of the house's power. I wasn't alone. That much was certain. But the question, the one that plagued my every thought, was who else was here? What else was here? I had crossed that threshold where reality and nightmare bled together. And now there was no telling what was a product of my own fear and what was truly a part of this cursed place. The whispers grew louder. Soft. Soothing. Like the hum of a lullaby sung just out of reach. They clawed at my mind, each word dissolving my thoughts, twisting them into new shapes, distorted, fragmented, and utterly alien. Every step I took felt like I was wading deeper into the very core of the house, as if it had teeth, waiting to bite. You're close, the voice whispered again. But this time, it was clearer, more distinct. It felt alive, pleased. The entity, or whatever it was savoring my fear. The smell of dampness and decay filled the air, thick and cloying. I could taste it on my tongue. You can feel it, can't you? The voice wrapped itself around me, pressing into my skull, slithering into the empty spaces in my mind. The pull, the weight. You'll never escape it. None of us ever do. A chill swept down my spine, the air freezing in an instant as though something had shifted in the atmosphere. My breath came out in visible puffs. I stumbled backward, my eyes darting toward the hallway, the darkness pooling at its end. There was something there, something moving. At first I thought it was my imagination, hallucinations from the mind-numbing dread. But then the shape moved again, unmistakable, slow, languid. as though it was slinking across the floor, taking its time. And it wasn't alone. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the shapes remained, their forms half-formed, shadowed by the shifting dark. They were too vague to make out, their outlines trembling in the flickering light, the flickering that never seemed to stop. Suddenly, one of the shadows jerked forward, and I froze. Not out of fear, not entirely. It was something deeper, primal, an instinct that told me that moving, fleeing, would only make things worse. The shape grew larger, more defined as it crept into the faint light cast from the hallway's dying bulbs. It was human, I could tell that much. But the eyes, God, the eyes were not human. Hollow, black as pits, unblinking, and staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I could feel the temperature in the room plummet. It wasn't the cold of winter. It was something else, something unnatural. The air grew thick with the smell of old paper, dust, and something decayed, something that had not moved in years. The figure didn't speak, but I heard its voice just the same. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a whisper. It was a feeling, an oppressive pressure in the back of my mind, telling me everything I needed to know. The voice was ancient, a crackling hiss that reverberated deep in my chest. "You've made a choice, haven't you?" It rasped, the words vibrating through me. "You thought you could break the cycle, that you could escape. But no one escapes." I wanted to scream, my throat constricted. I opened my mouth to cry out, but no sound came. It was as if my body had betrayed me. My limbs locked in place, my voice sealed within. The figure stepped forward, its dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that threatened to draw me into its gaze, to pull me into the endless abyss behind its stare. "You should have left when you had the chance," the voice whispered again, cold and mocking. A sharp pain erupted in my chest, a searing, burning pain. I gasped, clutching at my ribs, but there was nothing there. No wound, no injury to explain it. And yet the pain was real, a deep, gnawing ache that pulsed with each beat of my heart. I stumbled back, my hand falling to the wall for support. But the wall was no longer solid. It shifted under my touch, like something soft and alive, like flesh. "You're too far gone," the voice murmured, closer now. The figure inched forward, dragging its feet along the floor as though it were rooted to the very ground itself, unwilling to move faster, to show urgency. It wanted to savor my fear. It wanted to make sure I felt every moment of this. A voice, not my own, echoed in my head. A whisper so faint that it almost sounded like it was coming from someone else entirely. "It will be over soon." I looked up, heart racing, expecting to see the figure looming over me, but it was no longer in front of me. It was behind me now, just at the edge of my periphery. I couldn't move. My body was betraying me, frozen in place as I heard it approach. I tried to take a breath, to regain control, but it was like inhaling water, choking, suffocating. Every breath was heavier than the last. I was drowning in it. "There's no escape." The voice was louder now, surrounding me, thickening, wrapping itself around me like chains. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The weight of it pressed down, crushing my chest. And then I felt something. A cold hand. No, not a hand. A palm, pressing against my spine, against my neck, so cold that it burned. It was not flesh, not bone. It was something far darker, far older. It was a presence I had no name for, a thing born of darkness, of memories long buried and forgotten. The pressure was unbearable. And then, I heard the sound that I had been dreading all along. A scream, my own scream, but it was too late. Chapter 8. Whispers in the Void. It had been hours, maybe days. Time had long since lost its meaning. The walls of the house closed in on me like a living entity, shifting and groaning with an oppressive hunger. Each step I took seemed to bring me deeper into a labyrinth of impossibilities, a maze designed not just to confuse, but to unmake me. The air was thick with a staleness that smothered my thoughts, and the dim lights, flickering sporadically, offered only a feeble illusion of safety. I could hear something in the distance, or rather, felt it, like the tremors of an earthquake before it strikes. But there was something worse than the dark. Something worse than the shadows that crawled across the walls and disappeared into corners when I wasn't looking. It was the whispers. They were everywhere. They rose and fell like the crests of a wave, an eternal ebb and flow that was at once maddening and hypnotic. A chorus of voices, thousands of them, all of them calling out to me in a language I couldn't understand. But it didn't matter. I didn't need to know the words to feel the meaning behind them. The desperation, the rage, the fear. It wasn't just a sound. It was alive. It pulled at my very soul. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking I was imagining things. I even convinced myself that the whispers were just the wind passing through cracks in the walls. But the wind didn't have voices. It didn't carry the weight of centuries of anguish and betrayal, nor did it breathe the cold touch of something that had never truly been alive. This was something else entirely. Something old, something ancient. I pressed forward, each step slow and deliberate, my heart beating a little faster with every breath. The hallway stretched before me, endless. A tunnel with no end, the shadows at its edges alive, writhing as if they were conscious. The walls, too, seemed to be pulsating, a faint, rhythmic throbbing that reverberated through my entire body. The building itself was breathing. A door stood at the end of the hallway, cracked open just a sliver, as though inviting me in. It felt wrong. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn away, to leave this place, to run, to get out before it was too late. But that damned voice, the voice that had started as a whisper, was now a roar in my ears. Come closer. It wasn't a request. It was a command, one that I felt in my very bones. The compulsion was unbearable. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to. All I knew was that I had to move, had to reach that door. Something was waiting for me inside, and I had no choice but to answer its call. I walked toward it. The door creaked as I nudged it open, the sound grating on my nerves, yet it was almost comforting in its familiarity. The room beyond was cloaked in shadows, but I could make out the shape of something in the center, something sitting in a chair, its back to me. The whispering was louder now, closer. It had a direction, a target, me. And whatever it was that sat there, waiting, had been expecting me. The instant I stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, but there was no way to escape. The walls were too close, the room too small. I was trapped. The figure in the chair turned. It was human, at least it appeared so at first. The skin was pale, waxy, stretched too tight across the bones. The eyes, however, were not human. Black, empty, a void that reflected nothing, not even light. A smile twisted across its face, but it wasn't a smile. It was a grotesque mockery of one, a mask of madness. The corners of its mouth pulled too far back, revealing teeth that were far too sharp, too many. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen in place, my muscles locked, refusing to obey the simple command to move. My skin felt as if it were crawling, as though the air itself had thickened and was pressing in on me, smothering me with an unseen weight. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure whispered, its voice a rasping, bone-chilling sound that scraped against my very soul. The words settled into me like ice, creeping through my veins, numbing my thoughts. I could feel the pressure building inside my chest, the crushing weight of something terrible and vast pressing against the walls of my mind. The whispers, which had once been a faint murmur, were now an overwhelming flood, an ocean of voices that tugged at my consciousness, trying to pull me under. "You don't belong here," it repeated, the words punctuated by a low, guttural laugh that echoed in the confines of the room. Suddenly, the room felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in on me, pushing me forward, forcing me toward the figure in the chair. I couldn't stop it. My feet were moving of their own accord, my body no longer under my control. The more I fought, the more it seemed to push against me. There was nowhere to go. "You can't escape," the figure hissed. "Not from me, not from this place." With a violent jerk, I found myself standing directly before it. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought I might die right there, not by physical force, but by the sheer weight of its gaze. It was as though it could see through me, through every secret, every fear I had buried deep within myself. And then it spoke. "You're too late." The words sent a wave of nausea through me, the air thickening with the stench of decay, of something ancient and foul. It wasn't just the voice, it was the presence that came with it. The room, once still, now hummed with an unbearable tension, as if it were alive and breathing in time with the figure in the chair. "You've been chosen," it whispered, leaning closer. Its breath was cold against my face, like the chill of the grave. "You will become a part of it. You'll never leave." Suddenly the room seemed to warp, the walls bending inward, the ceiling shifting down as though gravity itself had begun to break apart. The whispers rose to a maddening crescendo, and in that moment I understood the truth. This house, this place, was alive, and it had been waiting for me. As the figure in the chair rose, its skeletal limbs creaking, I knew that whatever happened next, I wouldn't be the same. I had crossed into something far darker than I could comprehend. There was no escape. I was already lost. Chapter 8. Whispers in the Void. Part 2. I could feel the floor shifting beneath my feet, as if the very foundation of the house was moving, groaning under some terrible weight. The room had transformed. What was once a dim, claustrophobic space was now impossibly vast, stretching out like a cavern, its corners dissolving into shadows too deep to fathom. The walls had receded, and the ceiling seemed to sag, hanging low with the oppressive air of something ancient and forgotten. The whispers continued, a constant undercurrent, rising and falling like a tide that was about to crash. The figure before me, it, shifted in the chair. The motion was so subtle at first that I almost missed it, but then it became clearer. It was no longer just sitting, waiting. It was moving, the limbs creaking and stretching in unnatural ways, like a marionette being manipulated by unseen hands. The faint smile twisted on its lips, though I could see now that it wasn't a smile. It was a rictus, a grimace of malice, stretching impossibly wide as if it wanted to consume everything around it. Its eyes, black and hollow, locked onto mine. I couldn't look away, no matter how hard I tried. The very air around it seemed to pulsate, vibrating with a strange energy, an energy that wrapped itself around me, suffocating me, making it harder to breathe. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered again, its voice like ice scraping across the inside of my skull. "But you are, and now, there's no going back." The words felt like a heavy weight, a curse that had been cast the moment I stepped into this house. It was as if the place itself had chosen me, as though the very air I breathed was soaked with the suffering of those who had come before me, trapped in an eternal cycle. I wanted to run, to escape, but the whispers kept me rooted in place, each voice clawing at my mind, urging me forward. "You have no idea what you've walked into," the figure said, its voice shifting, becoming a chorus of others, a cacophony of voices all layered on top of one another, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. But the meaning, I understood the meaning. I had to move closer. Every step toward it felt like a betrayal of everything I knew to be true. The house, the shadows, the whispers, they were all closing in on me, becoming more oppressive with each passing second. But there was no escape. The air thickened with a foul stench, the smell of rot and decay, and the temperature plummeted, my breath coming out in sharp, visible bursts. "You've come to witness the end," it whispered, its voice shifting again, almost a purr now, like the caress of something predatory, something hungry. "This is the final chapter, and you are a part of it." I opened my mouth to speak, to ask why, to demand how I was involved in this, but before I could form the words, the room around me twisted violently. The walls seemed to fold in on themselves, rippling like paper caught in a storm. My body lurched, and I stumbled forward, unable to maintain my balance. Everything spun. My vision blurred as the room distorted into impossible shapes, the boundaries of reality itself bending and cracking apart. Was this real? The ground beneath me gave way. I fell. No, I wasn't falling. I was being pulled towards the figure. Its grin widened even further as I moved toward it, as if it reveled in my helplessness. "Don't resist," it cooed, and the voice now held an unnatural, seductive quality, as though it was tempting me, luring me in. "It's too late to turn back. You've already crossed the threshold." I reached out instinctively, as though I could stop the fall. My hand brushed against something cold, slick, smooth, and wet. My fingers sank into what felt like liquid stone. I gasped, pulling back in shock, but it was already too late. The touch had sealed my fate. The world around me was collapsing. The air thick with the smell of burning ozone, and something darker, far older, something that shouldn't exist. My vision pulsed with dark, blinding flashes, and I could see through them, for a brief moment, figures in the distance. Faces pressed against the walls, their eyes wide in terror, mouths agape, screaming silently at me, begging me to help them. But I could do nothing. As I fell toward the figure, a voice whispered in my ear, close, too close, like it was coming from inside my head. "You'll join them soon enough," it hissed. I hit the ground hard. No, not the ground. The floor wasn't solid anymore. It was shifting beneath me, as if I were tumbling into the very heart of the house itself. And the moment I landed, I could feel the cold seep into my bones. The whispers turned into screams, echoing in every direction, a chorus of despair that clawed at my sanity. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, but as I did, something cold gripped my ankle. I looked down, and my blood ran cold as I saw the shadows begin to crawl up my leg, thick and viscous, like tar, their tendrils wrapping around me, pulling me back down. I tried to pull away, but it was no use. The shadows were stronger now, growing in power, their grip unyielding. "You're not going anywhere," the figure said, its voice now a whisper in my ear, but it wasn't just its voice anymore. It was all the voices, layered together, suffocating me. "You're part of this now. You've always been part of it." The room shifted again, and the walls crumbled around me, revealing something beneath. It was a chasm, vast and endless, a bottomless void that seemed to stretch into infinity, and in that void, I could see faces, hundreds of them, writhing, their eyes wide with fear, their mouths contorted in silent screams. I was no longer in control of my body. It was as though the house itself was guiding my movements, pulling me toward the edge. My feet shuffled forward, slowly, inexorably, the shadow tendrils tightening with every step, dragging me closer to the precipice. "You've made your choice," the figure said, its voice echoing in the endless darkness. "You wanted to know the truth. This is it." And in that moment I realized what it all meant. This place, the house, the shadows, the whispers, it wasn't just a place. It was a prison, and I had been chosen to stay. I had been brought here to join them. The figures in the chasm stared back at me, their faces contorted in agony, their bodies twisting in impossible ways as they tried to escape the void. And I understood. There was no escape. This was the end, and I was just another soul to be lost within the house. Chapter 9. Echoes of the Forgotten. The darkness was closing in, thicker now, heavier than before. I could feel it pressing against my skin, suffocating me, blotting out the last traces of light. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the very air around me was laced with a palpable tension. Each footstep I took was swallowed by the oppressive silence, my footfalls muffled by an invisible weight. The house was alive, breathing with me, reacting to each movement I made, its walls shifting, its floors creaking like the bones of some ancient beast stirring from its slumber. I couldn't tell how long I had been walking, stumbling through the labyrinth of forgotten rooms and corridors. Time had no meaning here. It had ceased to exist the moment I stepped beyond the threshold. The place had a mind of its own, a cruel intelligence, and it was toying with me, leading me deeper into the bowels of its nightmare. The corridors I navigated seemed to stretch endlessly, like a maze with no exit. The house was vast, but each corner I turned brought me closer to something I couldn't quite place. The walls were adorned with peeling wallpaper, yellowed and curling, revealing glimpses of rotting wood beneath. The floor was carpeted with the remnants of a once rich velvet, now worn and stained, like a forgotten relic from a time long past. The air was thick with mildew and dust, but underneath that, there was something else, something foul, like decay, something that made my stomach twist and my throat tighten. And then, there it was again. The whisper, soft, insistent, like a breath against my ear. Low, guttural, and incomprehensible. It came from everywhere and nowhere. I tried to shut it out, to focus on something, anything else. But the sound only grew louder, more distinct. It was in my head now. "You're not alone," the voice whispered, its tone sharp and mocking. "You never were." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I was certain that there had been no one else in the house when I first arrived. Yet here I was, surrounded by something, a presence that I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. It was watching me, waiting. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I saw nothing. The house itself seemed to breathe in sync with me, its walls expanding and contracting as though alive, responding to my every move. And then, I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, something moving in the corner of my vision, too fast for me to fully comprehend. But then, it grew clearer, taking form, becoming something solid, something real, a figure, draped in shadows, moving through the hall ahead of me. It was humanoid, tall, and impossibly thin, with limbs that bent and twisted in unnatural ways, like a marionette controlled by some unseen force. Its face, if it even had one, was obscured by a black hood, its features hidden beneath a veil of darkness, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and suffocating, bearing down on me. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The figure moved with purpose, its steps deliberate and measured. It didn't hurry, but neither did it slow. It was coming toward me. "You can't run!" The voice hissed again, and this time I knew it wasn't just a whisper. It was a presence, a thing made of shadow and malice, attached to the figure that now approached. Instinct kicked in. I turned and bolted, my feet pounding against the old wood, the house creaking under my frantic movements. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. I had to get away from it, from them. The hall seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the walls closing in like jaws of a trap, forcing me down one corridor after another. I could hear it now, the sound of footsteps behind me, slow but steady, following me. Each step closer to my doom. It was chasing me. I tried to push my way through the suffocating darkness, but the house seemed to twist, to fight back. The floor beneath me buckled, making my footing unstable. A sudden creak rang out from the ceiling, and I ducked instinctively. The air was so thick now that it felt like I was moving through syrup. My legs were heavy, sluggish, and my pulse pounded in my temples. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't hide. It knew where I was. I glanced over my shoulder. There was nothing, just the same endless stretch of hallway, the shadows pooling into shapes that seemed to shift and warp as I looked at them. But I could still hear it, the scraping of claws, the dragging of feet, and that voice always in my head. I pressed on, the flickering of distant lights casting eerie shadows against the walls. Each room I passed was a nightmare, each doorway an invitation into a new hell. In one room, I saw a shattered mirror, its fragments reflecting distorted versions of myself. Eyes too wide, lips stretched into unnatural smiles. Another room was filled with photographs, old yellowed faces staring back at me. I couldn't recognize them, but I knew they were watching me, waiting for me to join them. I stumbled into another room, and my heart nearly stopped. The figure was there, standing in the center, its face still hidden beneath the black veil. It was no longer just an illusion, no longer a trick of the mind. It was real. I backed away, but I couldn't escape. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing forward, the shadows crawling up the floor, the ceiling, as if the house itself was going to swallow me whole. "I told you," the voice hissed, now coming from all around me. not just inside my head. You're not alone. You never were. I was trapped. There was no way out. And then the figure spoke. Do you see them? It asked, its voice a soft murmur just above a whisper. They've always been here, all of them, waiting for you. I looked around, panic rising in my chest, but I couldn't see anything beyond the dark, suffocating room. I could feel their presence, though. I could feel the eyes on me, staring from the darkness, waiting for me to understand. The souls of the damned. I knew it then, with a chilling certainty. They were here, locked in this place with me. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it had been waiting for me to join them. The figure took a step forward, its limbs creaking like old wood, its form bending and twisting unnaturally. It reached out, and I felt the coldness of its touch even before its fingers brushed against my skin. It's too late, it whispered. You can't escape the house. You've already crossed the threshold, and now you're a part of it. Welcome home. The finality in its words sent a jolt of terror through me. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness consuming the last shred of light, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I was not alone. I was never alone. Chapter 10. The Hollow Beneath. The walls were breathing. It wasn't the kind of sound I had expected. No creaking timber or groaning floorboards. No, this was deeper, more ancient. A rhythm that hummed through the very bones of the house. Each inhale and exhale echoed inside my skull. A rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from everywhere, nowhere, and everywhere again. It was as though the house itself had a heartbeat. A steady, deliberate pulse that aligned with mine, as if we were in sync. I tried to move, but my body felt frozen. It wasn't fear anymore. At least, not the kind of fear that made me run. It was something worse. The kind of fear that paralyzes, that renders you unable to escape, even though you know you should. My feet were glued to the floor, my breath shallow, every fiber of my being screaming to move, to flee. But my limbs betrayed me. From the shadows in the corner of the room, the figure stood, its shape more defined now, its presence heavy in the air, its form twisted unnaturally, as if reality couldn't quite hold it together. Every time I blinked, it seemed to shift, its limbs elongating, its body warping. It was no longer a shadow, no longer a mere spectre. It was an entity, something that defied all logic, all reason. You can't escape, it whispered again, its voice thick, like tar in my mind. It was not just a sound, but a sensation. The words felt like cold fingers curling around my thoughts, digging into my skull, pulling me into its twisted grasp. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. You've already chosen, the voice continued, almost tenderly, as if it were explaining something to a child. You've crossed the threshold, and now there's no turning back. This house, it's part of you now. And you, part of it. I couldn't process what it was saying, but a sickening truth began to creep into my awareness. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, and my heart pounded in time with the house's rhythm. The pulse, it was me. The house was sinking with me, pulling me into its horrific embrace. I was becoming part of it. The figure, if that's even what it was, moved toward me. Each step was measured, deliberate. It no longer had the frantic, disjointed movements it had before. It was calm now. The shadows around it shifted in unnatural ways, bending with its movements, twisting like dark smoke. I tried to move again, anything to break free, but my body remained unresponsive, as if my mind had been trapped in some kind of nightmarish prison. Every attempt to break free only seemed to drag me deeper into the suffocating silence. A low growl rumbled beneath the house, deep in the foundation, like something was awakening. The floor trembled beneath my feet. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. And then I heard it. A distant sound, a whisper at the edges of my mind. It was faint at first, but as it grew louder, I realized what it was. Voices, soft, mournful, echoing. They were all around me, a chorus of whispers, like the soft scrape of fingernails against the walls, the quiet, desperate murmurs of those who had come before me. the souls trapped in this house, the ones who had failed to leave, who had been consumed by the hollow. I turned in a circle, desperately searching for the source of the voices. But there was no one, only shadows, only the empty spaces where light should be. And yet, it was all dark. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows thickening, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. "It's too late to save them." The figure's voice broke through the cacophony of whispers, and this time, there was a sinister edge to it. "They're all lost, just like you." And then, it spoke in a different voice, an older one, harsh and guttural, like the rasp of dead leaves. "You think this place is just a house?" it croaked. "No, it is a prison, a sanctuary for those who have been marked. And now, you are one of us. You belong to the hollow beneath." My head spun. The ground beneath me buckled again, sending me to my knees. I tried to look up, but the shadows closed in, swirling around me like a storm of liquid darkness. The voices were growing more distinct now, clearer. I could hear their words, their cries. They were begging, pleading for something, for release, for freedom. But there was no freedom here. There never had been. There was only the house, only the hollow, the empty place where the lost souls wandered, where they would wander for eternity, trapped in a cycle of despair. And then, as if to seal my fate, I saw it. A door. The door I had been searching for, the one that had eluded me all this time. It was standing in the middle of the room, its frame dark and inviting. I knew in the deepest part of my being that this was it, the door that would lead me out. But as I took a step toward it, I heard the sound of footsteps, the unmistakable sound of someone or something walking behind me. I turned, and the figure was there. Its form was now more solid, more tangible. It was no longer just a shadow. It was real, and it was smiling. "You thought you could leave?" It taunted, its voice a twisted mockery of my own thoughts. "There is no leaving. Not now. Not ever." The door behind me was no longer there. The space where it had been was empty, just a wall, a solid, impenetrable wall. The figure reached out its long, bony fingers, and with a movement too fast for me to react to, it grabbed hold of my arm. Its grip was cold, impossibly cold, like the chill of the grave itself. The moment it touched me, I felt my body seize, my muscles locking in place, my breath freezing in my chest. And then, everything went dark.